I, not only on the board, but I am the middle school librarian here on Nantucket, and I'm joined by my sidekick and work best friend, Jill Supernant, the high school librarian. I can't even begin to say what an honor it is to introduce Ruta Sepetys. She is an internationally known best-selling author whose novels have illuminated corners of history and brought forgotten voices to readers around the world. Through her acclaimed works, Ruta has built a reputation for combining meticulous research with deeply human storytelling, creating books that resonate long after the final page, which 3 of my students can attest to that are in the front row. We are especially grateful for Ruta because she joined us this past fall as part of our visiting author program. Her time with our school community left a lasting impression, and we are delighted to welcome her back for this very special event. We would be remiss if we didn't extend our sincere thanks to Mary Haft. She is our festival co-founder and a tireless advocate for literacy in our school community in particular. She was the driving force in creating the Visiting Authors program, which we are so proud to say reaches every single student on Nantucket, pre-K to 12.
We are also incredibly grateful for the support that makes this program possible, including grants from the Community Foundation from Nantucket, the Nantucket Golf Foundation, and the Nantucket Cultural Council. We also extend our sincere thanks to Nantucket Book Partners and our generous donors whose commitment allows us to welcome distinguished authors like Ruta Sepetys to Nantucket, and reaching all of our schools, as Becky alluded to. Now, back to why we're here right now. Today we're gathering to celebrate Ruta's newest novel, The Fortune of Sand, a work that continues her exploration of the ways history shapes individual lives and the enduring power of resilience, hope, and human connection. Ruta's books have been translated into dozens of languages, received numerous honors, and inspired readers of all ages to engage with the past through the lens of unforgettable characters and stories. So please join us in welcoming today Ms. Ruta Sepetys.
The truth is, when Ruta was with us this past fall for our visiting author program, all of us fell in love with Ruta. And she just captivated not only our students, but our entire Nantucket Book Foundation committees. And this work matters. The work matters, which Ruta affirmed. When we're reaching our youngest students and through high school, it's transformational. And what our mission has always been, you don't have to aspire to be a writer, but for every single child who can learn to read, write, communicate, they can change their worlds. And Ruta was our most inspiring author, and also then her work became the theme. We have a Young Writer Award. It's a high school-wide essay competition. Our winner and finalists will be announced on Sunday, and we care so much about promoting this, and Ruta's work was the theme for this year's essay competition. So we really are thrilled, and honestly, we all fell in love with you. That is the truth.
Thank you, Mary, so much.
So the through line of all of your writing, and really she's globally renowned, and I would say, yes, she's so well known as a young adult writer. And young adult, there's a reason that category is actually being read by adults, because it is propulsive and immersive, and for everyone like myself, my twin sister, my little sister's here too, we're such readers as tiny children, really, and it's profound the impact that happens on a child. So your work that goes through young adults, those books take us into worlds we just would never have understood. So a through line of all of this writing is your exploration of history through human lives, histories that were not known or deliberately erased. How did you discover that this was your path, your mission, this would be your world?
To be honest, I had no idea. When I first began to pursue writing, I didn't think I was going to write about communism and fascism and systems of power. I thought I was going to be a humor writer. No lie. And I had written a middle grade manuscript, and a publisher had requested it. And I thought, well, gosh, I need representation. I better get an agent. So I submitted to an agent, and I thought at the last minute, you know, I should send something else I've written to show him the range of what I can do. And this was back in the day where you actually mailed the manuscript to the agent, you know, and the agent called me. And he said, your humorous manuscript, it's not so funny. He said, it's also derivative. And he said, I can see why a publisher wants it, because that kind of stuff sells, but there's a lot of it out there. And he said, but in the envelope, you included 5 pages of something else. And he said, what is that 5 pages? And I said, oh, it's something I'm working on. It's the story of my family who was exiled from Lithuania to death camps in Siberia. And he said, I don't know what you're doing, but I think I have an idea. You are saying, ha ha, look here, don't look here. And he said, your authentic voice is in that story of underrepresented history. In 5 pages, I can feel your heart clinging and wanting to give voice to this story. So we take many paths to get to a destination. Mary will tell you, I believe every single one of you in here has a story. You might not consider yourself a storyteller, but you still have a story. And I want you to reflect and archive on that. And it just so happened that when I leaned into my own story, that was what was authentic. And the agent also said, you get one chance, you know, you get one chance to make a first impression in publishing. How do you want to do it? And so I threw away that book that had a request from Harcourt, and I wrote what became my first novel, Between Shades of Grey, which does tell the story of Lithuanians deported to Siberia. And yes, still confused with 50 Shades of Grey. I have to say it all the time. I have to say it because it is.
But that story with your father, and again, I have the advantage of having been part of that day with our students. And what Ruta does too, and in her speaking, but in the books, it does make these stories so real. But you told a story, I would have jumped ahead, but we're already in your we're in your family history, which matters. And tell us a little bit more about what happened in your father's family. And then I always bring props, and you're gonna remember this, The Adventures of Pinocchio. And that links into this story with her father. So please tell us a bit more about what helped form who you are.
I am the daughter of what were 2 incredible human beings. My parents were refugees, they were freedom fighters, they were survivors. My mother was born the youngest of 11 children in the inner city of Detroit. Her father died before her 2nd birthday. It plunged the family into just such poverty. My father was born in Lithuania. When the Soviets occupied, he had to flee, and my father spent 9 years in camps before coming to the United States. And so those stories of finding strength through struggle, it was a big deal in our family. My parents always said, look, you can't choose your hardship, but maybe you can choose how you face your hardship. And that was so inspiring to me, Mary. And my father often talked about the impact that books had on him. Remember, the family fled a communist regime. And when they arrived in New York, the first thing they all did, they lined up to get a library card. They were living in a camp where they really didn't have any books. And my dad said it was so wonderful, but to go to the library. And I said, well, what books in the camp, you know, were you reading? And this, Mary, it ties back to my passion for freedom of expression and why I don't think books should ever be banned. When my father was a refugee, he was 4 years old in a camp, and he told me that they wanted a distraction for the little children because this was so harrowing what was going on. And there was a librarian in the camp who organized a story time. And one of the books that had been smuggled out was Pinocchio, which my dad always pronounced Pinocchio. Pinocchio. And mind you, this was not the Disney version of Pinocchio. This was the 1930s version from Carlo Carlotti that raised such objection. This man should never write for children. He's dangerous, what he's doing to young minds, because this original version of Pinocchio was starved, beaten, whipped, and had his legs burned off. And the refugee children loved it. Pinocchio! My dad said that they would listen. They would, be all lined up in this crescent, listening to the librarian reading the story of Pinocchio. And all those lessons of strength through struggle and survival, they were in Pinocchio. And so when we ban a book, we're taking an opportunity away from someone. We never know how a story is going to hold a soul, is going to feed a soul, is going to make the world less lonely for a soul. And like it did for my dad when he was 4 years old. Well, fast forward, and my father was in his 80s and unfortunately suffering from Parkinson's, and which had stolen his memory. And as I was, taking care of him and, and helping, and I needed to get a comb to comb his hair, and he was watching TV, and we had to be very careful about what we put on television. The Ukraine war had just broken out, if you can imagine the history of my father fleeing the Soviets and seeing that. So I'd put on Nickelodeon. And as I went to get the comb, all of a sudden I heard my father gasp. And mind you, my father, he didn't know who he was, and he didn't know who I was anymore. And he gasped, and I came into the room, and he was pointing at the screen, and he said, "Pinocchio, my friend, Pinocchio, my friend." 4 years old and 84 years old, right? We don't know how books are going to stay with us. And I have the honor and privilege of writing for young people who are going to carry our fading history into the future. What an incredible honor that is. And Penguin reissued, they did like a Penguin Classics line. And they said, we're asking authors to write introductions. And this is a lovely version of Pinocchio. And they did like a small little pocket book. And they gave me a list. And I could write the intro to Alice in Wonderland or to Anne of Green Gables. And near the bottom of the list was Pinocchio. And I wrote the introduction for my father.
Wow. But that's
yeah. So we don't know what we are taking away from someone. That book brought my father comfort at 4 years old and 84 years old, yeah.
And that's the power of story, which I didn't forget. From last fall, you're telling our students, it made such a powerful imprint on me. And like you say, this is the thing. And everything we take in, the books we read, make choices about what you take in, because they become part of you. They imprint upon your soul. This story imprinted upon my soul. I have told more people about it. It figured in another book that I saw. So it's powerful. And also, Ruta's message for our children was, one, we don't believe in banning books. We want children to have access to the ideas they need. Every child, one never knows the boundless curiosity or where they may go. But the other thing she really stressed, because here you are, a globally renowned, critically acclaimed author, but what you told your students mattered a lot too, because she could look out at all of them and talk to them about each one has a story, each one has gifts. And yours did not begin as a writer. You didn't start as a writer. You started 20 years in the music industry, and as you said, a song is a 3-minute story. So tell us about how that walked in, and there was a pivot point too.
Mary's peeling back my unsavory past. I didn't think this would happen here. I wanted to be Ruta the author, but yes, prior to becoming a novelist, I spent 22 years in the music business, and I had a front row seat to creativity, and I would never take that back. I helped songwriters and recording artists and rock bands and even some video game developers and film composers tell stories through music. And they, a song is a 3-minute story. And there's characters, there's a plot, things happened. And this was in the 80s. So we didn't have computers. I was sitting in a corner with a yellow legal pad as they were, co-writing the songs, and I was writing down the lyrics and then running upstairs and typing them up on an electric typewriter. But I learned that the songs where the artists put a piece of their own self, their own story into the song, those were the songs that were successful because they were authentic. Those were the songs that became anthems that people back then, they were raising lighters in arenas with all that hairspray and Camaro hair, right? They were like raising the lighters. But people resonated because when you said that, when we share our stories, we're sharing ourself. And that's an act of generosity, right? And then you're allowing someone to listen, and listening is an act of love. And there's this amazing exchange. Let's sing Kumbaya. No, there's this amazing exchange that happens. And so working in the music business really taught me the power of story. And so I asked the writers, what's your story? What's your story? And one day, one of the musicians asked me, okay, Ruta, what's your story? If someone asked you that, what's your story? Really just turn that spotlight on you. How would you reply? What would you say? My answer came out quickly. My story, I'm Lithuanian. And the lead singer of the band said, oh girl, I'm sorry, how long have you had that? Any Lithuanians in the audience? Labas, yes. So he said, with all due respect, not many of us understand what that means to be Lithuanian. I think you better find a way to tell your own story.
Well, what you did is more than just telling your story and more than just shining a light on the Lithuanian story. You've enlarged it to many histories that have been submerged, erased, and here's the powerful thing that you do, and we all are hearing it. Ruta has this beautiful heart and soul, and you feel it on the page, you feel it when she speaks, but she brings it to her characters who become alive, who become real. We're on that journey with them. We are traveling on the seas. We are hoping for survival. We are in the Soviet camps. We are living it, and neuroscience has shown, and this morning we had a wonderful event today with Lisa Genova, who is a noted neuroscientist and author, and I am fascinated by all of the neuroscience of this, but for all of us that are readers, we actually know this. When we enter a world in a book, we are entering a world that becomes very real to us. Yes. We feel the characters, we feel their pain, we feel their joys, we feel their laughter. And neuroscience is showing that actually those connections that are happening in our brain are being experienced as if we were experiencing it. And that is the extraordinary gift I think you have brought to all of your writing. And how do you do that? Because I know you're standing on the shoulders of real history, but then you're taking that to bring us into worlds not known and in many cases erased. And we will get to your current book, but everything that you do has this thread line through it. So how did you discover that was your way to tell the story?
I discovered that when I was writing my first book. Although I knew that 12 of my father's family members had been deported, I didn't have the story. Their story had been lost. 11 perished, and the only one that survived, when she came back, she wouldn't speak about what happened. And so I had to write my first novel, Between Shades of Grey, without the benefit of having my own family story. And that was very hard. But there were groups of incredibly generous people from nations who had experienced this: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, even Finland, Romania, and they partnered with me, Mary. And imagine that act of generosity, of revisiting the most painful experiences with a stranger that you don't know. And me asking them, what does it take to bear the unbearable? And they can tell you. And so I learned that they could become my co-writers. And in the beginning, I also learned that many are still very fearful. This experience hangs over them like a cold shadow. So they said, could I remain anonymous? Absolutely. So in some of my books, the characters don't have names. There's the bald man, the girl with the doll, the grumpy man, the man who wound his watch. And I learned that that was an effective technique where I was listening and then pulling threads of their story, braiding them into composite characters. So one character might represent interviews with 20 different people. And I think this is a benefit that I have of fiction, even though my work stands on the shoulders of nonfiction, as you pointed out, that through this braiding and composite technique, I might be able to represent a larger human experience instead of just one person's experience. And history has many angles, right? And we want to represent all those angles. And I can do that through that composite technique. And so that's what led me to that.
And just to say, as you're getting a sense of it, imagine what this must have taken to do the research. So just speak a little bit about, because writers approach it differently, how they decide, for novels that have historical value, people approach it differently. You approach it in a very exhaustive fashion. Tell us a tiny bit about researching a book.
Research has my whole heart. And I know this word research, Steve Schenken and I will never forget when we came here for Authors in the Schools. You guys might not remember this, but the students were coming through the signing line. And one of the students said, "You're talking about research and research. So that means you do homework for a living?" And I said, "No." I said, "Swap that word research with investigation." And Mary, that's what I do. When I start this, I say, okay, what am I investigating? Where are the holes? Whose voices have been silenced? And remember, when we're thinking about an event, when we're experiencing an event, like when people ask, will you write about what's going on right now? I try to explain, we have a limited view, right? It's as if we're looking through a first floor window with a current event. But with the buffer of 30 years, we're standing on the roof and we have a much wider, right, expansive view. So what I do is I do all of my reading, probably 2 years of reading. Then I travel to the place where the events occurred. I need to feel it, I need to smell it, I need to touch the ground, I need to know what it's like. And then I meet with true witnesses. And it might just start with one who agrees to meet with me. And as they're talking, I don't ask questions from a list. I ask sense memory questions, because I find that if I can immerse them in the setting safely that protects their heart, I don't know, they might recall things in a richer way. So for example, I wrote a book about the Romanian Revolution, 23 million Romanians controlled by their own fear through the secret police and a system of surveillance. And I had the privilege of meeting with a man, and some of you might remember these images from 1989, where there was an uprising in Romania, and the dictator unleashed the military on the citizens. And a group of high school students stood in front of tanks. And when I asked them, I said, it's December 1989. You're calling for freedom. You're standing in front of a tank. Take me there. And this man, who was a young man at the time, he said, Ruta, at that moment I determined I would rather die standing than live kneeling. I wanted freedom. And then all of this came out, Mary, about what the feeling of the wind and the nervous people next to him that were literally vibrating from fear. And so all of this composite technique, these people are my co-writers. I couldn't do it without them. I could not do it without translators. Those of you who speak another language, what a gift to give to an author. So it's really this team building kind of experience for my books.
But that's so generous too, because not many authors say, these are my co-writers, I've depended on these characters. And because you have done this exhaustive research, because you have lived and tried to step into their shoes, that's what you bring to the page, which is really an extraordinary gift. So I'm just going to encourage everyone to go get all those young adult books. They're just incredible. But it brings us to the book we are celebrating today, which is her debut adult novel, A Fortune of Sand. And once again, we're tying together threads of history, and again, kind of a personal history, because you are a Detroit born and bred girl, and you are bringing up the themes here go a little deeper than one might have imagined. And I'd love to say, how how did this start, and what was it that said, I think it's time to create a work that is now for an adult audience, much as, again, adults should be reading all of those other books. But how did you make that transition?
I am fascinated with things that were once vital but have now vanished. This can be people, places, products, powers that once ruled the world, right? And they lie buried and broken and forgotten. And I am from Detroit. And not many people know that Detroit was once considered the Paris of the Midwest.
That's right.
No joke. And I don't know if some of you know, if you have family roots here, there were 14 families on Sconset. You're shaking your head. The Detroit colony at Sconset, exactly. In the Detroit Free Press, in the Society page, every week they reported. And yet, what happens to those stories when they disappear, when they slip through the cracks of history? And what happens to the people who were associated with those stories? So first, I wanted to give voice to this hidden history of Detroit. And then every time I approach a topic, I think, what is the most respectful and appropriate way to approach this? And this is Prohibition era, and Prohibition called for an adult cast of characters. And this is a story of inheritance. What parts of ourself do we inherit? I was born in Michigan. I'm a Michigander. I inherited that, right? What mythologies from our family and stories do we inherit? But then what parts of ourself do we build? And what narratives do we create? And so it's a story of fortune and facade, because when I started peeling back and really doing my research and investigation about the 1920s, I realized the bill of goods that we've been sold on the 1920s, it's incomplete. Yes, there were flappers and jazz, but there was so much more going on, and yet we don't know that story. And when I say impermanence, the book is set in 1927, which provided this natural tension, right, of history and memory, because people are dancing, not knowing the floor is caving in beneath them, the crash is coming. And so I created a fictional family, the Lennox family, and the youngest daughter, Marjorie, she's the heiress to this automotive fortune. And she discovers a web of lies in her own family and then has to face a terrifying truth. Just how far will an American dynasty go to keep their secrets?
She says, I'm just going to quote from the book, Marjorie says, "The crooked crown of Lennox glass could be hers, but why would she ever want it? No throne stands firm on a fortune of sand."
Yes. And when I was researching, my research method for this was a little bit different, because most of my books are set in the more recent past, and this was in the 20s. So every morning, I read a newspaper from the day. So if it was June 13th or something, I'd read June 13th, 1927. And I would read Detroit papers, of course, and then I flipped over to the New York Times, and there was a story about a heist from the Detroit Institute of Arts that implied that a young woman from Grosse Pointe that was associated with one of these dynasties, that she was associated. And I thought, wait a minute, I just read the Detroit newspapers, there was no mention of that. What were they burying and why? And then I realized, if I go to the Battle Creek newspaper or Traverse City or Petoskey, they were telling the truth. And they were saying, this is what you need to know about this. And so that was a really interesting technique. And I did an event in Grosse Pointe at the home of the Algers, which is now the War Memorial. And they knew exactly what I was talking about.
And she has a couple more quotes, which I'll just say, which kind of is a good teaser. And for anyone who hasn't read this book yet, run out and get it. Ruta will be signing. But you write about Detroit. In the Motor City, men build empires out of loopholes and lies. And then one more time, and there's also kind of a wonderful romance, too, that I kind of loved. I think I was in love with him, too. What does one do when their family is a nest of secrets within a carnival of cons? So you're really getting an underbelly. And the other thing that was important, and it threads through again with our festival through a couple different ways, because it deals with institutionalism of women, of putting women into institutes. And you know, Nora O'Donnell's thread that we just had is about women who've been erased and buried. we had Lois Romano with Mary Todd Lincoln, whose son tried to institutionalize her. You know, this pulls up. Tell me how you came to that thread of the story.
Well, if any of you are from Metro Detroit and are of my vintage, you might remember the whispers of Eloise. And at the time, it was called Eloise Asylum. My mother and my aunt, and especially my mother, being from such an impoverished family, she had fears of there was a poorhouse at Eloise, there was a hospital, and there was an asylum. And you better behave or you're going to be sent to Eloise. And as I was reading the newspapers from 1920s, over and over again, what I was coming upon were these headlines where women were being institutionalized, and oftentimes the language around this in the 1920s was language of protection and safeguarding. And it wasn't that at all. It was language of control. And then, once I started identifying that language historically, I started to see it everywhere, even obviously today. And so I wove that in, and there are some headlines in the back of the book that I included, and I was in Texas, and they said, "Oh, we love how you fabricated those headlines." And I said, "No, those are real." And they were shocked. But again, what determines how history is preserved and recalled? And what happened to those women? I don't want to give any spoilers, but we're talking about women who were seizing power, you know, from a society determined to deny it. And I found that so inspiring.
Yeah. So, yes, this is so great. But I also have, because I think everyone is interested in the writing process. You know, how does one begin? So you explained to us, to the students, that there's really two kind of different styles of writing that you and Steve Shankin, who co-write the Bletchley Riddle, you described who you are and who Steve is. How do you explain that?
So, I know we have writers, we have authors, so many here, and you've heard this, it's kind of cliche. There's plotters and there's pantsers. Have you heard this? Okay, for those of you who haven't heard this, a plotter creates a very detailed outline of every chapter, almost a beat sheet, like you know, a screenwriter would write a beat sheet. And so when you go to write, you have this detailed outline, wonderful, and you just write per the outline. That's a plotter. A pantser flies by the seat of their pants. And when Steve Shankin and I, my co-writer on the Bletchley Riddle, decided we were going to write together, because we're both crazy about research and investigation, we assumed we had the same writing process. So we researched, and we didn't even ask, how we were going to approach this. And then finally Steve said, "Okay, so what's your process?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Your writing process." I said, "Oh, my process. I light a candle and we were on Zoom, and I saw his face come a little closer. And he said, "No, your writing process." And I stopped and I said, "I light a candle. Sometimes I close my eyes." And I'm thinking, and he leaned back and he said, "I am not comfortable with that." And I thought, oh my gosh. And he said, "Wait a minute, you do years. You travel to 6 or 7 different countries for every book. What do you mean you pants it?" And I said, "The research is in my head, in my heart. And then I let the creative process, I let the characters speak to me." And we had this impasse, like, are we going to be able to write this book together? And so we decided to plants it. And we plotted the whole thing, I promise you. If he were here, he would disagree. We spent 3 hours a day on Zoom. This is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. That's plotting. He claims it was pantsing. I don't know how, but I did find, I wrote the book, do not tell my publisher this, I wrote the book twice as fast. I had an outline, and normally history provides my outline, and I'm so cliche, I take long walks, I let the characters speak to me, and I didn't do any of that. But it just goes to show, I don't believe there's one way to write. There's your way. And like I said, every single one of you has something in your life, and it can be overwhelming, this word writing. But story isn't. And what if you do just write bullet point lists? It could be a year, 1954. The next bullet point is Detroit. The next one is, and then when you go back, write one sentence about each bullet point, right? Start small. And then a sentence turns into a paragraph, and then you're realizing, ooh, I can, I want to flesh this out. And like I said, then the door to memory opens. And but for the next novel, which is a very dark and sad novel that I have coming next year, I totally pantsed it, yeah. I didn't plot anything out.
This is even better than I remembered. I don't think you went into all that detail. But it is like a fusion. And I feel like with your writing, you've slipped into the slipstream of history. It's like your very cells have become part of the DNA of these stories. And how do you feel because your books are helping to create an interpretation and an understanding of history, how do you feel about that?
Well, first, I feel grateful because it would never happen without the help of teachers and librarians. I often say that students don't go running into a library saying, quick, give me a book about East Prussian refugees on a sinking ship. It doesn't happen. They don't do that. Teachers and librarians give the books to the students, and here they are, writers themselves. So I feel an enormous amount of gratitude. The other thing I feel is that I think if it's possible, to point out that, it's not just a headline, right? This history is not just a headline, that there are heartbeats behind it. And not even, certainly things necessarily that don't need to be tied in a bow, but if you can make the history human. Someone said it yesterday, that feelings stay with us longer than facts. And if I want the young students and readers to carry these forward, I have to make the history human. So it starts with gratitude, first of all, for my co-writers, for my helpers and colleagues, gratitude for the true witnesses who are sharing their story so bravely, even if they ask to remain anonymous. And I have to share something so powerful happened when the film adaptation of Between Shades of Grey, which is called Ashes in the Snow, it's a film on Amazon Prime, when it came out, we premiered it for the survivors, and they got to walk the red carpet to the story that was their life. And with the media interviews at the end, there were two people who stood up, and one man stood up and he said, "Good evening, I am the man who wound his watch, and my name is..."
Oh my goodness.
And he gave his name. And so when we share stories, when we share history, we are giving people courage to take ownership of their own story. That's how important this is, and that's why I'm so passionate. And I'm convinced that the world's most important stories, many of them, they still remain untold. And that whether that's because people feel it's obscure and no one will relate to it, Lithuanians starving in Siberia, everyone passed on that book, let me tell you. Everyone passed on that book twice, yeah.
But that's right. So as you look forward, what gives you hope in the world that we're in that is so massively divided, and in your writing soul, what gives you hope in moving forward?
I have studied resilience now, mining these parts of history, which are so harrowing. You think that all I would find is hardship, but I don't. What I find is resilience. And what is resilience and reinvention? These countries that were former Soviet occupied, right? And resilience is a powerful act of hope, Mary. And I see that. I see these countries who reappeared on the map, countries who are still, their fight for freedom still continues, we know, but that act of hope is so powerful. And when I meet with these survivors, they've taught me things that, for example, despair. When we feel despair, we've decided how the story's going to end. That's why we feel despair. We think we know. But history teaches us, like my book set in Spain during the Franco dictatorship or the Ceausescu dictatorship in Romania, people had no idea that freedom was so close. And so all of these stories teach us, do not despair. Do not despair. There's always hope, and hope is active. It's not passive, So there's so many lessons. And lastly, I will say that the young readers, they have such a sense of justice. Yeah. And I know the headlines point out always how doom and gloom this is, but if you have the opportunity, as you do, working with these programs in schools that you are supporting, the future is so bright. These students are beautiful and generous, and they have such a sense of justice, and I feel very hopeful.
Well, actually, a therapist told me this because my son became a Marine, a weapons platoon commander, served in Afghanistan. He brought 60 men home. He commanded 60 men. He brought 60 men home. We think part of it was from our house. We watched the Pentagon burn at 9/11. And a therapist said to me, well, like age 12 or 13, it's a very noble age. And so it's something to remember, again, when we're talking about work with children, the imprint you make is so much more than you understand. And I think your books do just that. And you've said how a story could hold a soul, but your books do save lives because they restore not only history, but our humanity. And we thank you so much, Ruta, for being with us and honoring our book festival.
Thank you. Thank you so much.